got a common assumption in some parts of the scholarly and non-scholarly world that the Gospels are Greek, or perhaps more specifically even Gnostic, or 2nd century in their origin, rather than 1st century or related to anything Jewish. I know this is going to take you a long way back. In essence, that's part of what the Da Vinci Code was all about. And boy, did it sell book after book after movie after movie. Or the whole idea of what's called the lost Gospels. All of that works from the same kind of common assumption, that the origin of these stories is Greek and or Gnostic. But I'm going to suggest, as you see it in the outline, that there is a strong Jewish connection, if not connections. A strong Jewish connection which firmly roots the Gospels in the Second Temple period. And the Second Temple period ended 2/3 of the way through the 1st century. You see, the Gospels have, as you see it first of all, a lectionary background or backdrop or substructure. Here's what I mean. Lectionary. In Judaism, we call it the Sedra cycle, or we call it the Parashiot, the readings that are selected by calendar for a particular day on the calendar. When you broaden out a little further to normal religious calendar reading, usually related to the Bible, they call it the lectionary cycle. And each part of the cycle is called, hang in there, election. Not as an election, but a lection, starting with the L. Okay? Now that we've said that, there are some who've proposed that Mark is a Messianic Passover Haggadah. And you could read it that way. Others have suggested that Matthew is what we call a festival lectionary. In other words, it has to do with readings related to the holidays. Luke has been proposed to be a weekly lectionary. In other words, a reflections on the readings for that particular Shabbat. Quick aside, in all likelihood at that time, the major cycle of reading was a 3-year cycle. We're not quite sure how early the 1-year cycle came to be. It may have already been beginning that way, but we know that it was at least a 3-year cycle. All right. John, on the other hand, looks like a midrashic commentary, much like the later midrash called the Pesikta Rabati, a midrashic commentary on the lectionary readings, but focusing especially on the holiday readings. Now, I'm not going to unravel much of that because in your handout, after the outline, you'll have something called some selected resources for the lectionary background underlying the Gospels. So I've given you what there? 6 different texts if you want to pursue this any further. So, there appears to be a lectionary background. The Gospels are connected to certain calendared readings. We also have a strong Jewish literary background. Item 2. Let me give you some examples. When you look at the book of Genesis, what do you have there? You've got hero stories. You've got Abraham and Sarah. You've got Isaac and Rebekah. You've got Jacob and Rachel and Leah. And up pops for a whole chapter Tamar. Important because she shows up in Yeshua's genealogy. Then you've got Joseph. So hero stories. Now take a look at Exodus through Deuteronomy. In effect, it's much like a Gospel of Moses in structure and in story. It's a story which begins at a river and concludes on a mountain. Does any of that sound familiar? And in between are interspersed many miracles and religious instruction. Along come the former prophets. If you're in that class, you're getting the point from Dr. Fischer, the other one. The former prophets, they provide for us sagas of heroes. So we read about Joshua. And if you're careful when you read about Yael. And you read about Deborah. And you read about, of course, Samuel and David and Solomon. But in these texts, the pictures of Elijah and Elisha certainly or clearly stand out in this context and within these texts. Sagas of heroes. Does that sound at all familiar to the kind of stuff in the Gospels? Then you get to what we call the Megillot, the scrolls. Ruth. Matt, you were talking to Chris about that earlier. Mm-hmm. It's the story of a hero. Esther. It's the story of 2 heroes, Esther and Mordecai. You look at the Second Temple literature itself as we explored before. You got Judith, Guess who that's about? And you got first and second Maccabees. Now I chose those three because they also happen to find their way into the Apocrypha. So in some circles have some sort of deeper respect. This is all part of the literary background of these texts. And then you've got the rabbinic writings, which demonstrate many content and approach parallels as well. For example, I'm going to be reading from the abstract of a dissertation that was written many years ago by a friend, Gregory Hag. The interrelationship between the New Testament and Tannaitic Judaism. Tannaitic Judaism, Tannaim, are the teachers whose teachings, the rabbis whose teachings were codified in what we call a Mishnah. So it's the early stage of development. All right, now, he did his dissertation on Pirkei Avot, perhaps the earliest of these things that was written down. And quite possibly somewhere contemporary in writing even with some of the Newer Testament. But anyhow, here's the abstract's conclusion. The interrelationship between the New Testament and you would call it early classical Judaism. Commonality is expected because both the Tannaim, these early teachers, and the New Testament writers were Jewish men quite familiar with oral law. Interesting statement just to begin with. Okay, Doc, continue. The extent of the interrelationship, however, has generally escaped the students of both sources. This dissertation contains over 400 New Testament references where the Tannaitic parallels are discussed. 400. Also, there is an appendix. I love this. This is typical dissertation stuff. Also, there's an appendix showing additional comparisons between the New Testament and another tractate, Avodah Zarah. Quick aside before I conclude this. That's exactly what you do. You limit your research. And then if there's something related to it that's more, you simply say, well, that's for somebody else's dissertation. So you caught that in the abstract? All right. There's an appendix showing additional comparisons between the New Testament and another tractate, Avodah Zarah, and I love the tractate he chose, dealing with the Jewish attitudes towards non-Jews. Quick aside. In other words, the attitude towards non-Jews that you find in the Talmud is the same as the attitudes towards non-Jews that you find in the Newer Testament. They're not opposites, and I can't tell you how often, when people deal with Galatians and Acts, they get that one all wrong too. Fair enough?